President Trump comes in, he'll sign lots of executive orders. In terms of priorities, tariffs, number one priority out there. The reason being is that under the power of the presidency, using an executive order, the presidency is more powerful there. President Trump can institute these tariffs without any congressional input.
The U.S. energy system is very integrated with Canada's. So we have a lot of oil that is produced up in Alberta. It flows often to refineries in the U.S. And so a 25% tariff, as I believe is the sort of proposal, that would have some pretty significant implications for kind of how to think about the energy complex in North America. So can you give us a sense? Are we really going to see 25% tariffs with Canada?
President Trump means exactly every single word he means when he talks about tariffs, because in his mind, it is a leverage tool that he can use to institute policy.
Consider that the refining slate here in the U.S. runs counter to the type of oil that we extract, meaning the light sweet versus the more complex refining slate. We need those heavier barrels coming down from Canada.
So Nathan, I want to pick your brain a little bit more on the IRA, and specifically within the IRA, there's a provision called the 45X manufacturing tax credit. I personally believe this is really one of the key provisions that's driven a lot of that manufacturing investment that you've described in places like Louisiana and other red states.
There's a lot of money, especially European CapEx money, that are coming into these southern states and so forth. And because the IRA is out the door and it's spurring this growth and it's spurring this investment and so forth, I'm just not sure that this is going to be where they're going to really try and bring the money in to pay for tax reform. Now, don't get me wrong, the electric vehicle mandates, the EV tax credit, so for that most likely will be gone.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Barnett, and I'd like to welcome you to today's BI Energy Exchange, where we talk about our research and the latest developments in energy markets. This is our first call of 2025, and I'm very pleased to have a special guest on today. So the special guest is Nathan Dean, who is one of our senior policy analysts based in Washington, D.C. Also on the call today, we've got one of our regulars, Vince Piazza, who's on the team, senior analyst covering oil and gas. And we thought it would be a great start to the new year to really get Nathan's perspective on what's going on in Washington, D.C. We obviously have a new Congress, an incoming Trump administration. And so, Nathan, I'm particularly here for this energy crowd. I wonder if you can help frame your expectations for what the priorities are going to be for policy in 2025. Is tax reform the big issue? Does any of it touch on energy? How would you read the tea leaves for this kind of segment here?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, and Happy New Year, everybody. So really what I've been telling my clients is that really just remember how Washington works. There's really three ways things get done in Washington. First is executive orders. President Trump signs something and has a, little ceremony over at the White House. The second is legislation, difficult to come by, but very impactful when it does happen. And the third is regulation. You can bypass the opposition party, but regulation, as you know, or in this case, deregulation, also takes time. So just remember, those are the three ways of things getting done. Now, I thought it would be helpful just to talk about timing in terms of the priorities and so forth like that. So here we are, January 8th. Congress has been in session for 5 days. Congress right now is working on confirmation hearings. And so the idea here is that they're going to have hearings starting soon. And then right after January 20th, they're going to try and go as fast as they can, they being the Republicans, to get President Trump's picks in order. And they're actually reaching out to the Democrats Democrats as we speak to try and find those picks that they can just put through unanimous consent, get all 100 senators to go on board. And so think of like Senator Marco Rubio from Florida as the Secretary of State. That individual would most likely get unanimous consent. So they're trying to focus on a lot of the national security picks as the early portion of it, but then there are going to be more contentious hearings like Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., and so forth like that. Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense. Those will actually get pushed off and probably until February and March, and you'll have those confirmation hearings. So that's one thing that's going on. The second is Inauguration Day. President Trump comes in, he'll sign lots of executive orders. In terms of priorities, tariffs, number one priority out there. The reason being is that under the power of the presidency, using an executive order, the presidency is more powerful there. President Trump can institute these tariffs without any congressional input. And so when he says that he wants to do something on tariffs, he wants to do it, because, he very much believes in it. He told our editor-in-chief, Bloomberg News, MBI's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, the tariff was his favorite word. He truly means that. But in the executive order, just look for language that would something potentially say he's going to direct the Department of Commerce to conduct a study. There's 4 ways of constituting or inputting tariffs. 3 ways actually calls for the Department of Commerce to go back and do a study. Think a 2-3 month delay, if you will. The other way, look, President Trump can flip it on day one. I looked into it. All he has to do is literally call customs, and they change a number in their system. They press a button, and the tariff goes on. So it can happen on day one. But our view on tariffs is that it's going to be probably a 2 or 3 month delay, because it also gives President Trump the ability to negotiate. When he threatens Denmark with tariffs over Greenland, for example, that's a negotiation ploy. So certainly it's something to keep in mind. But for President Trump's executive orders on January 20th, think tariffs and then immigration. You're going to see a robust immigration policy executive order. And then I'll talk a little bit more about how that plays in the congressional space. But again, the power of the presidency is more powerful there. You're also going to see some energy executive orders. Just yesterday, he announced that he was going to open up Alaska to additional drilling. You're certainly going to see a lot more offshore. He made some comments about wind. Rob and I love the joke about the wind outlook, because it doesn't look very rosy. Rob, tell me if you disagree, but it doesn't look very rosy under President Trump. He mentioned that. So again, when it comes to the energy sector, just remember, so most executive orders, I would argue, are symbolic. Fancy way of the president picking up the phone and directing his staff to do something. But because the energy sector has a little bit more power in terms of the presidency, and there's a little bit more going on in terms of all the sectors that we cover, these executive orders are more impactful to energy. So certainly something to call Rob and Vince and everybody else on the team to talk about as we get closer, so we can certainly help you navigate those executive orders. Now, moving over to Congress, this is where the tax reform, and those of you who are interested in the Inflation Reduction Act, comes in. So there's this process called reconciliation. You may have heard House Speaker Mike Johnson talk about this. This is a process that allows you to avoid the filibuster. Remember, any senator can stand up and say, I'm going to block debate from ending on this bill, and you need 60 votes to overcome that. The Republicans only have 53. So pretty much any legislation out there, you need 7 Democrats to go with. However, in reconciliation, you can bypass the filibuster by essentially passing not a bill, but a budget resolution. And so you just need a majority vote in the House, majority vote in the Senate, and then the president's signature. So the Republican plan at this point is to bypass the Democrats and use reconciliation for 1 or 2 bills this year. You can only do it once per fiscal year. U.S. fiscal year ends September 30th, so you could do one in the first 3 months, and then you could do one again in the fourth quarter. But this is how President Trump got his 2017 tax cuts through, and this is how President Biden got the Inflation Reduction Act through. So the Republicans, because the individual tax cuts for Rob, Vince, many of the Americans on this call, ends on December 31st, 2025, the Republicans are embarking on a grandiose plan to keep those tax extensions from, to continue on. They do not want to see those taxes go up. Now, in order to pay for that, it's going to cost somewhere to be $4 to $4.5 trillion. The most recent estimate I saw was 4.6 trillion. Now, how do you pay for that? Because under the process of reconciliation, you got to get it close. It doesn't have to be completely, it's supposed to be neutral, but you can use some fuzzy math just to get it close. So What's the strategy? How the Republicans going to do this? So over the break, the Senate strategy, this is Senator John Thune, the majority leader in the Senate. His strategy was to do two reconciliation bills. The first one would happen within the first 100 days of the presidency. It would focus on the border, defense, and domestic energy production. AKA here, we're going to give additional funding to support the immigration policy. We're going to bolster defense. And then we're also going to use the power of reconciliation to open up a little bit more in the energy space. They're at a very high level of trying to figure out what that means. So I can't give you more specifics on that. But this was the Senate plan. And then you were going to deal with tax reform after that. Now, President Trump was on board with that up until this past weekend when he embraced the House plan. And the House plan is one grand, and they call it, I'm not paraphrasing, this is their words, one big, beautiful bill. That's what House Speaker Mike Johnson said. Now, this bill is going to be border, defense, domestic energy, potentially tariffs as a way to pay for that. I don't think tariffs will be included, raising the debt ceiling, and also tax reform. And as a part of that tax reform debate, cutting, tweaking, or amending the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, our base case when it comes to the Inflation Reduction Act is that it's mostly safe. The Inflation Reduction Act is fairly cheap. I mean, if you have to figure out how to pay for 4.6 trillion, the Inflation Reduction Act only costs you 433 billion, and it's very popular. I think many people on this call know this. It's very popular because there's a lot of Rob's companies that are going into southern Trump states right now that are building factories, and I can pull out letters from state lawmakers in Louisiana to Washington saying, please don't touch the IRA. I got a plant being built here in Louisiana that's building 700 jobs. That's going to be very difficult for the Republicans to be able to cut, gut, or tweak the IRA when there are a lot of popular provisions of that. However, the discussion is certainly going to be taking place. The debate is going to be taking place, and it's certainly questions are going to be asked. So where does Congress go from here? I think they're going to start with the idea of having a grandiose bill. They're going, Speaker Johnson said that he wants to have this vote by April, the House vote, by April. He said it could potentially be May, but don't be surprised if it takes additional time, because that's the one thing that you have to remember here is when it comes to Washington, Congress doesn't act unless it has to. And there's not a lot of must-pass dates coming up where if you don't do something, something bad happens. In March, we have a government shutdown. That certainly is going to be a government shutdown threat. That's certainly going to take some congressional time. The debt ceiling expired on December 31st. The X date, if you will, of when Treasury can use extraordinary measures, it's probably June, July. Our rate strategists will have a better idea after tax day, April 15th, just because it really depends on how much money the U.S. is bringing in. And then the tax cuts don't expire until December 31st. So before those dates, Congress has to do something, which could be the incentive, if you will, to get Congress to act. So right now they're starting with one bill. I wouldn't be surprised if they broke it up into two, but the biggest challenge that House Speaker Mike Johnson has is that with a couple of members of the House going to President Trump's cabinet, with Representative Matt Gaetz resigning, he can only afford to lose 2 or 3 votes, and that is going to be extremely difficult for the Republicans. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but it's certainly going to be extremely difficult. So flexibility and optionality are going to be the 2 words for the first half of the year, because they're starting with this plan. But once we get into negotiations and see where the nitty-gritty and the detail is, certainly things can change. So I know I went really quick there. I know I went long, but also very fast. So, always happy to have conversations. And Rob, again, thanks for allowing me to come on.
Okay, thank you so much, Nathan. What a rich tapestry. Okay, so I want to kind of get some rapid fire response perhaps from you on a few of the items you just laid out, and then I think there's a clever way to bring Vince into this. So first, on this idea, there's headlines on the terminal yesterday about incoming President Trump talking about the idea of no new wind farms or wind turbines built under his administration. I'm pretty sure there's no executive order that can be issued that can really bring the entire industry to a halt. But you tell me, is that a scenario folks should really be worried about? Maybe on federal land, but sort of all of the other projects that are already in process, surely they still go ahead, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to remember, what is the president's authority here? The president has authority of the executive branch. He doesn't have authority of the legislative branch, doesn't have authority of the judiciary, and he doesn't have authority of state uh, jurisdictions either. So when President Trump puts out an executive order and he says, "Okay, I'm signing no new wind farms in the United States," signs it up, has this over, et cetera, he can only do that for the area that he controls, which is federal land and within the executive branch. Now, they can certainly make it more difficult to institute new projects and so forth like that. They can certainly, and a lot of questions we get about DOE loans, for example. There's a lot of companies out there that have been looking into DOE loans. Once the money is outside the door, unless there's actually language in that loan, and I'd have to, each loan is different, but once the money is outside the door, that money is essentially gone. Now, if the money has not left the U.S. federal government's coffers, then Congress can certainly, or the executive branch agencies can certainly go back and tweak those. So, President Trump, and don't get me started, we can talk about the Doge Commission, if you will, and all that other stuff. But just remember that the president, Congress, agencies, and so forth, that has to be within their jurisdiction. And there's a lot of things that are outside of their jurisdiction that they just don't have control over.
Okay, very interesting. So I think the part of the equation to keep an eye on perhaps is what particularly goes on with the nascent offshore wind industry in the US, probably a bit more headwind there. So Nathan, I want to pick your brain a little bit more on the IRA, and specifically within the IRA, there's a provision called the 45X manufacturing tax credit. I personally believe this is really one of the key provisions that's driven a lot of that manufacturing investment that you've described in places like Louisiana and other red states. So specifically, I get a lot of questions from our clients around the idea of that specific provision. It's so if you had to handicap specifically within the IRA, would you give more credence to the idea that that specific provision prevails, or is it all or nothing? How do you think about 45X? Because I think that's the one that most people have their eyes on, probably on this call, if they're in the clean energy space.
Yeah, and for the folks on this call, Rob actually called me about this yesterday, so he's leading me with this question right now. And I talked to an energy lobbyist just yesterday about this, and I said, "What do you think about the 45X?" And this lobbyist, and I'm deferring to the lobbyist because I haven't, I haven't looked at this in specifics, but this lobbyist put 45X into the low risk category of repeal, because the IRA is a great talking point. When President Trump says, "I want to get rid of the IRA," it didn't pass with any Republican support. It was a Democratic only objective. But for the reasons that we outlined earlier, there's a lot of money, especially European CapEx money, that are coming into these southern states and so forth. And because the IRA is out the door and it's spurring this growth and it's spurring this investment and so forth, I'm just not sure that this is going to be where they're going to really try and bring the money in to pay for tax reform. Now, don't get me wrong, electric vehicle mandates, the EV tax credit, so for that most likely will be gone. Elon Musk has been in favor of doing away with that. We've talked to our autos analyst about that. Tesla is a high premium product. You don't need the $7,500 just to buy a $90,000 Tesla. Staves off some low cost competitors, for example. So I wouldn't be surprised if the EV tax credit goes out, but the 45X, this lobbyist told me, was in the low risk category of being repealed. I will say, however, that just remember how this works. Congress says, here's a tax credit. It is then up to the Department of the Treasury and the IRS to put out a rule to say how that tax credit works. Now, even if Congress doesn't touch that tax credit, Treasury has the right to go back and conduct another rulemaking to change the parameters of the tax credit. And that is something that I would think was probably be more of a likely scenario than you see Congress play with it, because Congress is just going to look at the political impact and also the dollars and cents of it. But Treasury, on the other hand, could actually look at it and say, yeah, let's change the parameters of that. I just don't have a good feeling of what Treasury would do yet, but again, something to keep in mind.
Well, I'll follow up then just quickly on that. So my sense is on the 45X, it is available to domestic manufacturers and foreign manufacturers. There seems to be some concern that there could be some tinkering to somehow try to exclude it from some of the foreign entities, but yeah. we'll see. And I don't have any inside baseball on how that conversation goes. Okay, so before we bring Vince in, I want to probe on just one other topic because you started with tariffs. So for anyone on this call who doesn't know, I think it will be sort of very common knowledge to everyone here, but the U.S. energy system is very integrated with Canada's. So we have a lot of oil that is produced up in Alberta. It flows often to refineries in the U.S. And so a 25% tariff, as I believe is the sort of proposal, that would have some pretty significant implications for kind of how to think about the energy complex in North America. So can you give us a sense? Are we really going to see 25% tariffs with Canada?
President Trump means exactly every single word he means when he talks about tariffs, because in his mind, it is a leverage tool that he can use to institute policy. And there's a lot of folks in Washington, if you take Russia and Ukraine, for example, there's a lot of folks out there who talk about the difference between sanctions and tariffs. And a lot of folks in Washington will say the sanctions regime on Russia failed. Didn't really change behavior, didn't change anything. But tariffs could be different. And when President Trump says that he wants to put tariffs onto a country like Canada, for example, he truly does believe it. When Justin Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago, one of the questions that, and this came from Bloomberg News reporting, Prime Minister Trudeau said, well, so much of our economy relies on the United States. And President Trump's response to that was, well, you mean your entire economy relies on our goodwill because we're running a deficit right now? Then maybe you should get a different economy. And, it's a difficult question. It's an awkward question, but it's something that President Trump is certainly going to ask. And so, but I would also just say that we're now in the soap opera portion of the White House, meaning you have this pro-tariff crowd, but you also have an anti-tariff crowd. You have a Wall Street pro-Wall Street crowd, Scott Bessent at the Treasury, for example, and so forth like that. And so you just saw reporting from the Washington Post this week on how the tariffs may be pared back. President Trump came back on Truth Social and said, no, that's not going to be the case. But you're getting to the point now where you're going to have one group campaigning against the other group, but ultimately it's going to be President Trump's decision. So I take the fact that these tariffs are real risk/opportunity for those of us in the investment space. But President Trump also wants to negotiate, and it really is the deciding factor of those negotiations. For example, just last thing I'll say is that there was an article on CNN this morning talking about President Trump may institute a new economic disaster declaration to institute tariffs on Mexico. He actually tried this back in 2019. But Mexico sent individuals to the United States. They reinstituted Remain in Mexico policy, and those tariffs never actually came to fruition. So again, it's a negotiation. I will say there's a real risk/opportunity. I always say opportunity just because there is an opportunity for everything. The real risk or opportunity for these tariffs on Canada, but it's always still subject to the negotiation that's going to take place.
Okay, Vince, I want to get your reaction to some of this. So let's start with tariffs. You cover some of your names have assets in Canada. What's your sense? I mean, how much would tariffs really impact the way to be thinking about the energy relationship between the U.S. and Canada?
Well, consider that the refining slate here in the U.S. runs counter to the type of oil that we extract, meaning the light sweet versus the more complex refining slate. We need those heavier barrels coming down from Canada. So again, I think that, as Nathan said, it's more about negotiation as opposed to a reality to force. Basically, if these tariffs were enacted, you're forcing us to go outside of North America to source those barrels. So it becomes counterproductive for us to do this. As you probably know, and I'll state again, as I've mentioned many times, I'm on the 50-yard line of politics. So to me, it's more or less the economics behind the initiative, behind the strategy. And look, Biden can block leases offshore. In reality, there's plenty to do here on land in the U.S. We're not going to grow very much in 2025 in terms of oil and liquids, but we will grow nat gas. Nat gas is really constrained by infrastructure, which is another issue, which is probably a more prevalent concern as opposed to leasing. Allowing permitting of and right-of-ways for infrastructure build-outs that provide the highway to move gas from the producing region to the consuming region. That's my real concern, and there hasn't been much said about this by either side. I think that's the overwhelming concern that I have. But really, there's a positive to that as well. The opportunity set is you sort of support prices, right? If you don't have overproduction, you support that price. And it's sort of in that Goldilocks period now where, WTI is in that 74, 75 range. Nat gas has popped to about 360 toward the end of the year. It even touched $4 recently, but that was unsustainable as well. Here's where I am on this. Put politics aside. Business people make decisions based on the business needs. And what investors are telling these businesses today is we want relatively modest growth and we want excess cash back in our pockets. So the businesses are going to be flexed based on free cash flow yields. What I'm really concerned about is taxes on dividends and taxes on buybacks. That is my overriding issue as opposed to permitting and offshore leases and tariffs for our Canadian partners.
Vince, I want to probe a little bit more. I hear you on not being too concerned about tariffs, but maybe let's set aside the Canada tariff idea specifically. And you did mention this idea about growth in natural gas. And one of the potential pitfalls of tariffs is if we put them in place, other countries will respond with their own set of tariffs. We have become the world's largest LNG exporter. Does the idea of other countries throwing up tariffs possibly put the brakes on our LNG export narrative in your mind? Is that something that's got you a little bit concerned, or is that still taking a backseat to some of those other items you just mentioned?
Well, so this is Trump 2.0, and we've all appreciated what Trump 1.0 was all about. And as Nathan mentioned, a lot of this is about negotiation. He means what he says, but a lot of it is about negotiation. Again, I'm less concerned about the bluster, and the reality before us suggests that Europe needs those LNG flows. Right now, they should be somewhere around EU net gas storage should be somewhere around 85%. It's somewhere around 70% today. So we've seen depleted inventories during the time where they need to be seeing those inventory flows higher. And we also have one of the last pipelines being shut down that provides Russian gas. So that is a concern as well. Those are my overriding concern. Longer term, the rest is intermediate noise to me. So as former portfolio managers, as a former portfolio manager, I'm taught to take into account the overarching issues and not get bogged down in the day-to-day noise. And to me, this is more along the lines of day-to-day noise that injects some intermediate volatility. But the overarching concern is, how do you build more infrastructure and to produce more? And how do we get more flows overseas to our European partners to rebuild their storage? Because the geopolitics still remains the overarching concern over there in Europe.
Okay, Vince, there's a question in the chat related to the 45V tax credit. We talked about 45X a little
Yeah,
earlier. So 45V is the clean hydrogen tax credit.
yeah,
And I know a number of your companies have been pursuing some hydrogen
yeah,
related
yeah.
projects and activities. Give us a sense of how important that is.
Um, well, we haven't really seen a considerable investment in that area. One company, CNX, took quite a hit on the announcement. Friday, the stock was down pretty heavy, and throughout the course of this week, it's underperformed as well. In their case, what they're looking to do is to unleash some of their coal assets to clean up some of their coal assets and leverage that 45V. But it seems as though that the rule that came out on Friday, and Nathan, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seemed to be more restrictive for the uses. And so it, the economic value of that asset for a CNX, which is probably the most interested in this type of initiative, in this type of strategy, and had invested more than several other entities. It became less economically valuable or viable for them to pursue it going forward. So it remains to be seen where we end up with that. But CNX seems to be more exposed as they were further down the line on a development case for that particular initiative.
Thank you, Vince. Okay, Nathan, let's get you back into the conversation. So, a couple of ideas. I don't know if you have any comment on 45V. I feel like it's a much smaller piece of the overall equation, though highly relevant for anyone who's got H2 exposure. But any sense, anything you've heard on that one in particular?
Well, it's funny. Whenever they put out final rules this close to a new administration, the spidey sense begins to tingle. Like, is an administration trying to ram something through at the end? The sense I got is that's not exactly the case here. This is one of those where I think they just are. The rule came out. I think it becomes effective on Saturday, for example. So I certainly think as we get into and we see what the new executive leadership is, if they have issues with it or if the industry comes back and lobbies hard against it, you could certainly see them tweak it. But I just remember if it comes out via regulation, the same agency has the ability to go back and deregulate it via the same process. So it just takes time. So, I mean, the quickest I've ever seen it done is 6 to 9 months. So I would just say that if there is an issue with it, then it can easily be changed in 2025.
Okay, very cool. Uh, Another idea. There was a question in the chat, and I think you already answered it. I'm not sure if everyone can see that. So the question just relates to permitting reform, and so when the IRA was passed, there was companion legislation that would have across a variety of asset classes made it easier to get permits to put steel in the ground. So whether solar, wind, pipelines on down the line. And Vince mentioned this idea of pipeline capacity to get gas and oil molecules from the producing regions to the consuming regions. And this is a big narrative, big theme sort of generally in the space. Is there anything on the table as far as permitting reform out there that's on your mind?
So this is in being a question of how are they going to try? So, they tried this at the tail end of 2024. It didn't happen. And so the talk now is about including it into the reconciliation bill, this one big, beautiful bill using House Speaker Johnson's words. So this is where it gets a little technical for the Washington speak. So because if you put something via reconciliation, it has to adhere to what's known as the Byrd rule, BYRD. This is this is the South West Virginia senator, not Byrd's, and they have what's called the Byrd bath. So let's say they try and do permitting reform via reconciliation. So they put it into the bill. They have this Byrd bath, and then the Senate parliamentarian comes out and says, "Well, wait a minute." this does not impact the budget. The Democrats tried this before in the IRA by trying to raise the national minimum wage to $15. Senate parliamentarian came and said, no, that doesn't impact the budget. You can't do that. It doesn't survive the Byrd rule. It's gone. So if you talk to a bunch of Democrats out there, they'll say that it won't be able to survive the Byrd bath. If you talk to Senator, I think Senator Cruz from Texas, for example, said absolutely it can go through reconciliation. Who's the one who decides? The Senate parliamentarian. Now, generally speaking, yes, the Senate could just fire the Senate parliamentarian and get a new Senate parliamentarian, but the Senate generally respects the Senate parliamentarian. So I think at this stage, the Republicans are going to try and figure out, can they get this through the Senate parliamentarian? And if so, then you're going to see it in the reconciliation bill. If not, then you need 60 votes in the Senate. So I'll just say that it's one of those issues where I don't anticipate it's going to be happening fairly quickly. Look, Congress has a lot on its plate. I mean, if you think about it, they have to avoid a government shutdown in March. They have to deal with the debt ceiling by June or July. They have to deal with tax reform, which could take them an entire year. So I would just say that just remember, Washington doesn't move fast. So if it doesn't go through reconciliation, they're certainly going to try, but you're probably looking at a 2026 issue rather than a 2025 issue.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathan. We are a little bit over, but I'm going to keep you and ask you a couple more cues about things happening in DC. And so I'm curious. There was also this idea that I've seen floated by maybe it was Elon Musk, Vance, Trump, talking about if there's an entity that wants to spend $1 billion plus in infrastructure in the U.S., that they would be handed all their permits on an expedited basis. And I think there was some idea about reducing the NEPA review process. Any sense on what can you frame that for us? Is that a real conversation? Is that just a Twitter conversation, or is that something that could actually happen, which I think is a little bit separate from what you were just describing?
Yeah, so that idea came from President Trump. He even said, if you're going to invest $1 billion, I'm going to cut all the regulatory red tape and we're going to do it. But the regulatory red tape still exists for a reason. And most of that is actually required by law. And so this is where, again, it gets into the discussion, and this is where the Doge Commission comes in, if you will, the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. The question here is, can you actually cut this regulatory red tape? Well, I would argue they were in power for 4 years before, and they didn't, because it's very difficult to cut regulatory red tape. There's lots of talk about like the Federal Register. Anytime a regulation is finalized, you get 500 pages. It goes into the Federal Register. Last I checked, the Federal Register, I think, is about 280,000 pages long. And so these are all the regulations that govern everything in the United States. And there's a lot of talk of actually, okay, well, let's gut the Federal Register. Let's cut a lot of this regulations. Well, the process for that is there's no magic wand. You can't just wave a magic wand and say deregulate and be done with it. You have to follow the Administrative Procedures Act. And this is a requirement that you have to have a public comment period. You have to have a proposal. In many cases, you have to have a cost benefit analysis. Then you need to put out a final rule. That final rule needs to be written in a way by lawyers that will actually stave off court, scrutiny, if you will, and so forth. I'm just saying I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm just saying the Washington process is designed it's not designed for speed. And so there's certainly ways that they can look at it and say, yes, you can cut this review, you can cut that review. If it's within the power of the executive branch and it doesn't require an APA rulemaking, then yeah, they can probably cut a lot of that. But if it requires an APA rulemaking, then the process goes much slower. So certainly they're going to be looking at ways to cut this efficiency. I do think that they will be able to make these reviews go faster. If you look at the M&A space, something that we've covered, bank M&A, for example, has been taking years. It could go much quicker in this scenario. So I don't want to give the impression that it can't happen. It certainly can, but you just got to figure out, what does the executive branch have authority over versus what are they bound by the Administrative Procedures Act? And then that will give you an idea of the process and the time and the ability of whether you can use this magic wand and say, just go forth and cut the tape.
Okay. Thank you, Nathan. For anyone who wants to go deep on how the change in administration, the change in Congress could affect not just energy markets, but markets generally, Nathan has a great deep dive. It's about a 60-page report. Vince and I are collaborators. A number of folks on the energy team pitched in to kind of help frame the energy piece, but it goes well beyond energy, looks at many other aspects of how policy could affect markets. You can find the deep dive at BI Deep Go, or you can message any one of us. We'll make sure you get a copy. And Vince, before we go, I want to depart from policy for just 1 second and flag that you did speak a little bit about natural gas, and you have a focus idea on natural gas. For anyone who doesn't know it, focus ideas are you know, uh, sort of out of consensus ideas that we have strong conviction on. So, I mean, I think they're sort of a notable piece of the franchise. You can find them by visiting BI Focus Go. And Vince's, you just did a recent update on your natural gas views. So, you want to quickly tell us about that, given it is one of your big themes for the year?
Yeah, sure. So we're definitely more positive on natural gas and have been positive for the last year plus. Natural gas had a low two handle when we got positive on it. It's now north of 360. We were looking at 350 for the winter. We saw a recent spike through $4, but that was brief. We think 350 is right around the area where you won't see significant production come online, but it provides a good medium for companies to produce at a relatively healthy level and generate some substantial free cash flow to build liquidity. And no, I think we're okay there. As we think about 2025, it's really going to be on the demand side because we know we have the output. So the demand, not only the cyclical demand, but also the structural demand that you and the rest of your guys talked about for AI and LNG as well. So I think we're in a good spot.
Okay, fantastic. I think we'll leave it there. So just quickly, a couple of announcements. One is we have an existing client chat called the BI Energy Exchange on the terminal. If you're not in that chat, I highly recommend it. It tends to have a more oil and gas focus, but it's pretty ecumenical, broad spectrum. We also have a more focused energy chat that we've recently launched called BI Future of Energy. It's a bit more about wind, solar, hydrogen, gas, these kinds of things. So if you're interested, again, reach out to any one of us. We'll make sure you get into the chat if it's something that you would like to participate in. Second, we hold these calls every Wednesday. If you're on this call, we'll make sure you get an invite to the next one. And we sort of generally rotate through members of the team, but we also have external speakers on occasion. So on Feb 5th, I believe, the first Wednesday of February, we've got Jeff Osborne and John Miller from TD Cowen scheduled to join us. That should be an exciting conversation. We've got a few other folks that we're talking to try to get dates in place. And if you would like to nominate a potential speaker that you want to come on and have them join this conversation, feel free to nominate them. Nominate yourself even. I know we've got a sort of great cast of folks who call in, and I'm very humbled by many of the folks who want to listen to what we have to say. I would be very happy to sort of listen to many of our callers wax philosophically about some of these issues as well. So again, thank you for your time. I hope your 2025 is off to a great start, and we look forward to being in touch. Reach out to us anytime if you have follow-up questions or you want to talk about any of the ideas or research that we are generally publishing. Take care, everyone. Have a great week.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.